should have had the laptop out. Make sure this shit sound right. Okay, this is our Rockford reading segment. I'm gonna turn I know the mic a little low. I'm gonna turn the mic up some. All right, there we go. But also, all right, we're reading Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s autobiography. This is I think maybe the third or fourth time that we've read through or the third or fourth time we've done one of these Rockford readings with the autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. being the book that we're reading. So what I'm doing right now is making sure that the audio is all good. Pull this up. All right, yeah. Okay, we're good on the audio front. If you're watching this video, go ahead and share it. I'm finna share this video real quick on my page. If you're watching this video, go ahead and share it. I'm finna share it. Mute. Okay. We're Chapter 5 of Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. Chapter 5 is entitled Coretta, which is the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife. So this particular passage is about him meeting his wife in college and somewhat about their relationship. As with all the things that we've read out here as we're going through and reading this chapter, if at any point in time I feel there are some things that we can correlate to the struggle to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice in Winnebago County, if I can find anything within the passages we're reading that can correlate to that, I'll take some time out to speak on those things. But for now, let's pick up on Chapter 5. It was in Boston that I met and fell in love with the attractive singer Coretta Scott, whose gentle manner and air of repose did not disguise her lively spirit. I had met quite a few girls in Boston, but none that I was particularly fond of. I was about to get cynical, so I asked Mary Powell, a friend from Atlanta, who was also a student at the New England Conservatory of Music, quote, "Do you know any nice, attractive young ladies?" End quote. Mary Powell introduced us, and I was fortunate enough to get Coretta's telephone number. We met over the telephone. Quote, "This is M.L. King Jr. A mutual friend of ours told me about you and gave me your telephone number. She said some very wonderful things about you, and I'd like very much to meet you and to talk to you." End quote. We talked a while. Quote, "You know, every Napoleon has his Waterloo. I'm like Napoleon. I'm at my Waterloo, and I'm on my knees. I'd like to meet you and talk some more. Perhaps we could have lunch tomorrow or something like that." End quote. She agreed to see me. "I'll come over and pick you up. I have a green Chevy that usually takes 10 minutes to make the trip from BU, but tomorrow I'll do it in 7. She talked about things other than music. I never will forget the first discussion we had was about the question of racial and economic injustice and the question of peace. She had been actively engaged in movements dealing with these problems. After an hour, my mind was made up. I said, so you can do something else besides sing? You got a good mind also? You have everything I ever wanted in a woman. We ought to get married someday. I didn't want a wife I couldn't communicate with. I had to have a wife who would be as dedicated as I was. I wish I could say that I led her down this path, but I must say we went down it together because she was as actively involved and concerned when we met as she is now. I told my mother, quote, "Coretta is going to be my wife," end quote. On June 18th, 1953, we were married. Although we had returned to Marion to be married by my father on the Scots' spacious lawn, it was in Boston that we began our married life together. Coretta Scott is a native of the South. She is from Marion, Alabama, and she went to college in Ohio, Antioch College. Having inherited a talent for music from her mother, Bernice Scott, as well as the strength of quiet determination, she had then gone on with the aid of a scholarship to work her way through the New England Conservatory in Boston. She wanted to be a concert singer. She was a mezzo-soprano, and I'm sure she would have gone on into this area if a Baptist preacher hadn't interrupted her life. Coretta's father, Obie Scott, a short, stocky man of dark complexion, is a strong and courageous man. People are strongly attracted to him because of his warm personality. He loves people and is always ready to help somebody in need. Although reared on a farm, Obie Scott was always concerned about going into business for himself. He finally succeeded and operated a trucking business, a combination filling station and grocery store, and a chicken farm. Despite the reprisals and physical threats of his white competitors, he attempted to get ahead in these various businesses and dared to make a decent living for his family. He has never been an Uncle Tom, but he had to suffer certain insults and even humiliation in order to survive in his community. The amazing thing is that he came through all of this with his courage undaunted, without becoming bitter. Coretta often made comparison between me and her father. Even in the early days of our courtship, she used to say, quote, "You remind me so much of my father," end quote. I don't suppose any compliment could be more inflating to the male ego. Coretta's mother, Bernice Scott, is quite different from her father in many respects. In contrast to his overflowing personality, she is rather shy. She is an attractive woman, fair in complexion, possessing narrow features and long black straight hair. And knowing her, one soon detects that she is a person of courage, determination, and amazing internal strength. She is deeply devoted to her family, always willing to sacrifice her needs to those of her children. More than anyone else, she taught Coretta her moral and ethical values, not by what she said alone, but also by her example. My devoted wife has been a constant source of consolation to me through all the difficulties. In the midst of the most tragic experiences, she never became panicky or over-emotional. I have come to see the real meaning of that rather trite statement, a wife can either make or break a husband. My wife was always stronger than I was through the struggle. While she has certain natural fears and anxieties concerning my welfare, she never allowed them to hamper my active participation in the movement. Corey proved to be that type of wife with qualities to make a husband when he could have been so easily broken. In the darkest moments, she always brought the light of hope. I am convinced that if I had not had a wife with the fortitude, strength, and calmness of Corey, I could not have withstood the ordeals and tensions surrounding the movement. She saw the greatness of the movement and had a unique willingness to sacrifice herself for its continuation. If I have done anything in this struggle, it is because I have had behind me and at my side a devoted, understanding, dedicated, patient companion in the person of my wife. I can remember times when I sent her away for safety. I would look up a few days later and she was back home because she wanted to be there. Coretta was never satisfied in being away from me, but she could not always be with me because she had to stay home with our 4 rather young children. She did join me on some occasions, and she was always a deep consolation to me, supporting my every move. I didn't have the problem of having a wife who was afraid and trying to run from the situation, and that was a great help in all of the difficulties that I confronted. Coretta had to settle down to a few concerts here and there, because she has been a pastor's wife and mother of our 4 children, Martin Luther III, Dexter Scott, Yolanda Denise, and Bernice Albertine. When I thought of my future, I also thought of my family. I had to think of what's best for them also. One of the frustrating aspects of my life has been the great demands that come as a result of my involvement in the civil rights movement and the struggle for justice and peace. I have to be away from home a great deal, and that takes me away from my family so much. It's just impossible to carry out the responsibilities of a father and husband when you have these kind of demands. But fortunately, I have a most understanding wife who has tried to explain to the children why I have to be absent so much. I think in some way they understand, even though it's pretty hard on them. That brings us to the end of chapter 5. I think one of the things that I would like to point out is, again, just as when Dr. King was talking about giving some of the backstory to his father and his mother's experiences growing up in the time in which they grew up and they had to deal with racial injustices. So again, when he speaks about his wife's father's upbringing and his wife's father's life, he speaks about the inherent racial injustice that surrounds him. And so both, again, just to reiterate a point that's sort of been made already before, both Dr. King and his wife came from we're not coming from impoverished families, came from families that were more well off for for being black in the times in which they were black. But those things were not enough to insulate them from the racial injustice issues which existed. So I think that that's something, again, to keep in mind about the further back you go. It didn't matter whether you were the richest black person in the county or the poorest black person in the county. Your children had to go to black schools. You had to live in an area that was considered the black area of town. You dealt with whatever injustices came with police in the city and community that you lived in. And you dealt with whatever individual or institutional racism that existed in the community, and you couldn't buy your way out of it. Okay, Chapter 6, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. After being in school 21 years without a break, I reached the satisfying moment of completing the residential requirements for the PhD degree. The major job that remained was to write my doctoral thesis. In the meantime, I felt that it would be wise to start considering a job. I was not sure what area of the ministry I wanted to settle down in. I had a great deal of satisfaction in the pastorate and had almost come to the point of feeling that I could best render my service in this area. I never could quite get the idea out of my mind that I should do some teaching, yet I felt a great deal of satisfaction with the pastorate. 2 churches in the East, one in Massachusetts and one in New York, had expressed an interest in calling me. 3 colleges had offered attractive and challenging posts, one a teaching post, one a deanship, and the other an administrative position. In the midst of thinking about each of these positions, I received a letter from the officers of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery saying that they were without a pastor and that they would be glad to have me preach when I was again in that section of the country. They had heard of me through my father in Atlanta. I wrote immediately saying that I would be home in Atlanta for the Christmas holidays and that I would be happy to come to Montgomery to preach one Sunday in January. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church had a rich history. Many outstanding ministers served there, including Dr. Vernon Johns. It was a very fine church with even greater possibilities. On a cool Saturday afternoon in January 1954, I set out to drive from Atlanta, Georgia to Montgomery, Alabama. It was one of those clear, wintry days when the sun bedecked the skies with all of its radiant beauty. After starting out on the highway, I happened to have turned on the radio. Fortunately, the Metropolitan Opera was on the air with the performance of one of my favorite operas, Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor. So with the captivating beauty of the countryside, the inspiration of Donizetti's inimitable music, and the matchless splendor of the skies, the usual monotony that accompanies a relatively long drive, especially when one is alone, was absorbed into meaningful diversions. After about a 4-hour drive, I arrived in Montgomery. Although I had passed through the city before, I had never been there on a real visit. Now I would have the opportunity to spend a few days in this beautiful little town, which has the distinction of being one of the oldest cities in the United States. It occupies an undulating site around a sharp bend in the Alabama River in the midst of rich and fertile farmland. Not long after I arrived, a friend was gracious enough to take me by the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where I was to preach the following morning. A solid brick structure erected in Reconstruction days, it stood at one corner of a handsome square not far from the center of town. As we drove up, I noticed diagonally across the square a stately white building of impressive proportions and arresting beauty, the state capitol, one of the finest examples of classical Georgian architecture in America. Here, on January 7th, 1861, Alabama voted to secede from the Union, and on February 18th, on the steps of the portico, Jefferson Davis took his oath of office as President of the Confederate States. For this reason, Montgomery has best been known across the years as the cradle of the Confederacy. Here, the first Confederate flag was made and unfurled. I was to see this imposing reminder of the Confederacy from the steps of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church many times in the following years. Okay, so I want to take some time and stop and talk there about some of the implications of Montgomery, some of the implications of these symbolic things that Dr. King has pointed out about Montgomery. Montgomery will be the place where the infamous Montgomery Bus Boycott would begin at, and would continue through. The entire campaign will continue through there. The Montgomery Bus Boycott has been noted as one of many catalysts in what would be the civil rights movement that took place in the late 50s and throughout the 60s and early 70s. But different people have different points in time in which they begin and end the civil rights movement. For the most part, I have seen a consensus of the civil rights movement starting in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, and ending in 1968 with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and with some of the concessions that the United States government gave after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And so in 1954 would be when Dr. King would give his first sermon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and it would be August 26, 1955, when I think this speaks of Rosa Parks. When Rosa Parks would inform Dr. King of him becoming the executive. Being on the executive chair of the Montgomery NAACP chapter. And so it is in between 1954 and 1955 that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. becomes part of the community in Montgomery. And it's important to point out that Montgomery is where even Dr. King got his beginning. The SELC, which would be the organization that he has, would also get their beginning there. Ralph Abernathy, which is another person who's a staple in the civil rights movement, would get his beginnings here in Montgomery. And as they pointed out, Montgomery was the place that Alabama voted to secede from the Union. Montgomery was the place that Jefferson Davis took his oath of office as president of the Confederate. So inherently there's a strong racism that exists individually and institutionally inside of Montgomery, Alabama, and inside of Alabama in general. And so for Dr. King and the community of Montgomery to wage such a strong struggle in a place that has such strong ties back to the Confederate, I believe was something that was a striking blow for the institution of racism that existed. I think that that's one of the reasons it's important to know the local history, because local history is what begets or begats regional history or state history, and then that goes on to begat national history. And so sometimes I think that a danger that can happen is that people look at national history too much, or things that are nationally symbolic too much, without taking the time to look at the things that are locally symbolic that have more of a direct impact on your life. And so I think that it's important for us. I say that to say I think it's important for us to know things that have originated in Rockford and things that have originated in this area of Illinois, and the implications that those things have had regionally and nationally. So that way we understand the symbols that must be destroyed. And I think another one of the things I want to point out is that in the South, vastly different from the North, there were so many more reminders of the symbolic history of racism and the symbolic history of bigotry that existed because of things like the Confederate flag being outside of state buildings, because of things like people who had history with the Confederacy having statues and having plaques in some of these areas in the South. And so it was a constant reminder of the history that existed in some of these areas. And again, the repression is what a lot of times brings the masses of people together to fight against some of these institutional evils. And so that repression that they was constantly greeted with from seeing this state building that had historical significance with ties to racism, with seeing the Confederate flag with historical ties to racism, I believe is something that gives onus to people wanting to struggle to change what their society's status quo is. And I believe that because when you live in the North, with those things being covert, with those things being hidden, with those things being not celebrated in the same manner, sometimes we have to remind people of the things that exist here and the implications that they have. So sometimes you have to remind people that we have a school here named Jefferson High School, and Thomas Jefferson is a infamous racist. Thomas Jefferson had up to 700 slaves, raped the slaves, had children with those the slaves that he raped, and then after having children with the slaves that he raped, he enslaved those children as well. And so there shouldn't be the same way that you can see in the South that they're struggling against places where the Confederate flag is hoisted at, and places where statues to historically known racist people are being torn down at. We have to do the work of trying to get rid of Thomas Jefferson High School, having that school named something different, getting rid of Abraham Lincoln Middle School, having that school named something different, with the understanding that as long as we continue to allow these symbolic racist as long as we continue to allow these symbols of racism to exist, we're allowing a certain philosophy of racism to also exist, whether people are conscious or subconscious of some of these things. But that was a detour. Let's get back. Saturday evening, as I began going over my sermon, I was aware of a certain anxiety. Although I had preached many times before, having served as associate pastor of my father's church in Atlanta for 4 years, and actually doing all of the preaching there for 3 straight summers, I had never preached in a situation in which I was being considered for the pastorate of a church. In such a situation, one cannot but be conscious of the fact that he is on trial. Many questions came to my mind. How could I best impress the congregation? Should I attempt to interest it with the display of scholarship? Or should I preach just as I had always done, depending finally on the inspiration of the Spirit of God? I decided to follow the latter course. I said to myself over and over again, quote, keep Martin Luther King in the background and God in the foreground, and everything will be all right. Remember, you are a channel of the gospel and not the source, end quote. With these words on my lips, I knelt and prayed my regular evening prayer. I closed the prayer by asking for God's guidance and his abiding presence as I confronted the congregation of his people on the next morning. With the assurance that always comes to me after sincere prayer, I rose from my knees to the comfortable bed, and in almost an instant, I fell asleep. I rose early on Sunday morning, a custom I follow every Sunday in order to have an hour of quiet meditation. It was a beautiful morning. From my window, I watched the sun rise in the eastern horizon and move out as if the point is technicolor across the lofty blue. I went over my sermon one more time. 11 o'clock soon came around, and I found myself in the pulpit of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. A large congregation turned out that morning. My sermon topic was the 3 dimensions of a complete life. The congregation was receptive, and I left with the feeling that God had used me well. I was also greatly impressed with Dexter and his vast possibilities. Later in the day, the pulpit committee asked me if I would accept the pastorate in the event they saw fit to call me. I answered that I would give such a call my most prayerful and serious consideration. After this meeting, I left Montgomery for Atlanta and took a flight back to Boston. About a month later, I received an airmail special delivery letter from Montgomery telling me that I had been unanimously called to the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. I was very happy to have this offer, but I did not answer immediately. Now I had to face up to the problem of what had to be done about the several offers that had come my way. It so happened that I was to take a flight to Detroit, Michigan the next day, where I was to preach the following Sunday. I thought about this important matter all the way to Detroit. It was one of those is it time for court? It's not court time, is it? Yeah. For the guy. Oh, okay. You going? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's see where we are. Okay, 44. Okay. It so happened that I was to take a flight to Detroit, Michigan the next day, where I was to preach the following Sunday. I thought about this important matter all the way to Detroit. It was one of those turbulent days in which the clouds were hovering very low, but as the plane lifted itself above the clouds, the choppiness of the flight soon passed away. As I sailed along, noticing the shining silvery sheets of the clouds below and the dark deep shadow of the blue above, several things came to my mind. At this time, I was torn in two directions. On the other hand, I was inclined toward the pastorate. Excuse me. At this time, I was torn in two directions. On the one hand, I was inclined toward the pastorate. On the other hand, toward educational work. Which way should I go? And if I accepted a church, should it be one in the South with all the tragic implications of segregation, or one of the two available pulpits in the North? Now I thought, as the plane carried me toward Detroit, I had a chance to escape from the long night of segregation. Could I return to a society that condoned a system that I abhorred since childhood? These questions were still unanswered when I returned to Boston. I discussed them with my wife, Coretta. We had been married less than a year, to find that she too was hesitant about returning to the South. We discussed the all-important question of raising children in the bonds of segregation. We reviewed our own growth in the South and the many advantages that we have been deprived of as a result of segregation. We reviewed our own growth, the question of my wife's musical career came up. She was certain that a northern city would afford a greater opportunity for continued study than any city in the Deep South. For several days, we talked and thought and prayed over each of these matters. Finally, we agreed that, in spite of the disadvantages and inevitable sacrifices, our greatest service could be rendered in our native South. We came to the conclusion that we had something of a moral obligation to return, at least for a few years. The South, after all, was our home. Despite its shortcomings, we had a real desire to do something about the problems we had felt so keenly as youngsters. We never wanted to be considered detached spectators. Since racial discrimination was most intense in the South, we felt that some of the Negroes who had received a portion of their training in other sections of the country should return to share their broader contacts and educational experience. Moreover, despite having to sacrifice much of the cultural life we loved, despite the existence of Jim Crow, which kept reminding us at all times of the color of our skin, we had the feeling that something remarkable was unfolding in the South, and we wanted to be on hand to witness it. With this decision, my inclination toward the pastorate temporarily won out over my desire to teach, and I decided to accept a call to Dexter for a few years and satisfy my fondness for scholarship later by turning to the teaching field. Big ass bees. So I went back to Montgomery. Because of my desire to spend at least 4 more months of intensive work on my doctoral thesis, I asked for and was granted the condition that I would not be required to take up the full-time pastorate until September 1st, 1954. I agreed, however, to come to at least once a month. I agreed, however, to come at least once a month to keep things running smoothly during this interim period. For the next 4 months, I commuted by plane between Boston and Montgomery. Okay, and then that's not the end of the chapter, but I want to take some time to speak on the implications of some of the things that Dr. King wrote about there. I think that that mindset that Dr. King wrote about of him and Coretta feeling that they needed to return back to the South because so many people were leaving the South and getting educated in the North, but not bringing that information and bringing that education and bringing those resources back down to the South is something that's very telling about just the black community overall. And one of the things that has happened very routinely in the black community is that black people have grown up in the black community or lived in the black community and then or lived in a certain community, impoverished community, or a poor community or a working class community, and then from that community they have left from that community to get whether it be college education or training or some type of entrepreneurial venture, and instead of returning back to that community and providing those resources or that knowledge or that wisdom back to the community that they left, in hopes to pull people along with them, they go to a different community or they go to a different area and they just continue to add knowledge to an area or to a community that already has it, or continue to add resources or wisdom to a community that already has some of those things. And so I think that it's important to point out that we need more people with that mentality that Dr. King and his wife had, where they had grown up in the South dealing with the shortcomings of segregation, dealing with the institutional evils of segregation and racism, and they had escaped that in a sense to become more educated in the North, to become more informed in the North, and instead of just staying and keeping that education in that area, they return to pass that down to people in the South who were less privileged than them, and who were not able to get that information and education because they felt that the most dutiful work that they could do was in the South, was in the area where people were the most disenfranchised and the most marginalized. And so I think that's something that we have to also keep in mind, is that just as important as it is for us to find a way to get the information, to get the education, to get the knowledge, it is also important for us to find a way to bring those things back to the communities that we came from. Fucking fly. Okay, let's see if we can knock this chapter out before this for our phone battery. This phone battery die. On a Sunday in May 1954, I preached my first sermon as minister of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. It is a significant fact that I come to the pastorate of Dexter at a most crucial hour of our world's history, at a time when the flame of war might arise at any time to redden the skies of our dark and dreary world. What up, what up, what up, what up? At a time when men know all too well that without the proper guidance, the whole of civilization can be plunged across the abyss of destruction. At a time when men are experiencing in all realms of life disruption and conflict, self-destruction, and meaningless despair and anxiety. Today, men who were but yesterday ridiculing the Church of Christ are now asking the church the way to the paradise of peace and happiness. We must somehow give our generation an answer. Dexter, like all other churches, must somehow lead men and women of a decadent generation to the high mountain of peace and salvation. We must give men and women who are all but on the brink of despair a new bent on life. I pray, God, that I will always be able to lead Dexter in this urgent mission. I pray to God that I will be able to lead Dexter in this urgent mission. I come to you with nothing so special to offer. I have no pretense to being a great preacher or even a profound scholar. I certainly have no pretense to infallibility that is reserved for the height of the divine rather than the depth of the human. At every moment, I am conscious of my finiteness, knowing so clearly that I have never been bathed in the sunshine of omniscience, or baptized in the waters of omnipotence. I come to you with only the claim of being a servant of Christ and a feeling of dependence on his grace for my leadership. I come with the feeling that I have been called to preach and to lead God's people. I have felt like Jeremiah. The word of God is in my heart like burning fire shut up in my bones. I have felt with Amos that when God speaks, who can but prophesy? I have felt with Jesus that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and to set at liberty those that are bruised. Montgomery was not unfamiliar to Coretta, for her home was just 80 miles away. I teased her that she had better be thankful. If she hadn't married me, she'd still be back in Marion, Alabama, picking cotton. Since her teens, she had breathed the free air of unsegregated colleges and stayed as a welcome guest in white homes. Now, in preparation for our long-term return to the South, she visited the Negro section of town where we will be living without a choice. She saw the Negroes crowded into the backs of segregated buses and knew that she would be riding there too. But on the same visit, she was introduced to the church and cordially received by its fine congregation. And with her sense of optimism and balance, which were to be my constant support in the days to come, she placed her faith on the side of the opportunities and the challenge for Christian service that were offered by Dexter and the Montgomery community. The church work was stimulating from the beginning. The first few weeks of the autumn of 1954 were spent formulating a program that would be meaningful to this particular congregation. I was anxious to change the impression in the community that Dexter was a sort of silk stocking church catering only to a certain class. Often it was referred to as the, quote, big folk church, end quote. Revolting against this idea, I was convinced that worship at its best is a social experience with people of all levels of life coming together to realize their oneness and unity under God. Whenever the church, consciously or unconsciously, caters to one class, it loses the spiritual force of the, quote, whosoever will, let him come, end quote, doctrine. And the and it is in danger of becoming little more than a social club with a thin veneer of religiosity. For several months, I had to divide my efforts between completing my thesis and carrying out my duties with the church. I continued to study as hard as usual. I rose every morning at 5:30 and spent 3 hours writing the thesis, returning to it late at night for another 3 hours. The remainder of the day was given to church work, including, besides the weekly service, marriages, funerals, and personal conferences. One day each week was given over to visiting and praying with members who were either sick or otherwise confined to their homes. On September 1st, 1954, we moved into the parsonage and I began my full-time pastorate. The first months were busy with the usual chores of getting to know a new house, a new job, and a new city. There were old friendships to pick up and new ones to be made, and little time to look beyond our private lives to the general community around us. My installation at Dexter was held on October 31st. Daddy came down to preach the sermon and brought 100 people. It was a great success. Members of Ebenezer Baptist were present and contributed. Their presence in large numbers meant much to me at the beginning of my pastorate. Their generosity and bright-heartedness were in the forefront and continued to prove to me that there was but one Ebenezer. I felt greatly indebted. I would remember that occasion so long as the cords of memory would lengthen. I took an active part in current social problems. I insisted that every church member become a registered voter and a member of the NAACP and organized within the church a social and political action committee designed to keep the congregation intelligently informed on the social, political, and economic situations. The duties of the Social and Political Action Committee were, among others, to keep before the congregation the importance of the NAACP and the necessity of being registered voters, and, during the state and national elections, to sponsor forums and mass meetings to discuss the major issues. Two members of the Social and Political Action Committee, Joanne Robinson and Rufus Lewis, were among the first people to become prominent in the bus boycott that was soon to mobilize the latent strength of Montgomery's Negro community. I joined the local branch of the NAACP and began to take an active interest in implementing its program in the community itself. By attending most of the monthly meetings, I was brought face to face with some of the racial problems that plagued the community, especially those involving the courts. Around the time that I started working with the NAACP, the Alabama Council on Human Relations also caught my attention. This interracial group was concerned with human relations in Alabama and employed educational methods to achieve its purpose. It sought to attain, through research and action, equal opportunity for all the people of Alabama. After working with the council for a few months, I was elected to the office of vice president. Although the council never had a large membership, it played an important role. As the only true interracial group in Montgomery, it served to keep the desperately needed channels of communication open between the races. I was surprised to learn that many people found my dual interest in the NAACP and the council inconsistent. Many Negroes felt that integration could come only through legislation and court action, the chief emphasis of the NAACP. Many white people felt that integration could come only through education, the chief emphasis of the Council on Human Relations. How could one give his allegiance to two organizations whose approaches and methods seem so diametrically opposed? This question betrayed an assumption that there was only one approach to the solution of the race problem. On the contrary, I felt that both approaches were necessary. Through education, we seek to change attitudes and internal feelings, prejudice, hate, etc. Through legislation and court orders, we seek to regulate behavior. Anyone who starts out with the conviction that the road to racial justice is only one lane, anyone who starts out with the conviction that the road to racial justice is only one lane wide will inevitably create a traffic jam and make that journey infinitely longer. After I lived in Montgomery about a year, I became the proud father of a little daughter, Yolanda Denise. Yoki was a big little girl. She weighed 9 pounds and 11 ounces. She kept her father quite busy walking the floor. And then the bus boycott began. And that brings us to the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. There we go. Montgomery movement begins. And now chapter 7, Montgomery movement begins, will be the beginning of the documentation of the struggle that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. engaged in during the Civil Rights era. these first six chapters have sort of been planting the seeds and giving you the background and the backstory that will be important to understanding why he waged the struggle and the manner in which he waged the struggle. I think that one of the things, and our battery's getting low here, so I want to be able to end this myself, so I don't want to take too much time to harp on these things. But I think that something that is very important that Dr. King brought up is the idea that there's not only one approach to solving the race problem, and that was true in 1954 when Dr. King stated it in this book, and it's true now in 2021. There is not only one way to solve this the race problem and solve these issues. There was a multitude of different ideologies and philosophies that got us here, and a multitude of different tactics that got us here, and it's going to take a multitude of different philosophies and ideologies and tactics to get us away from here, to get us to a more equitable society. And so I think that is something to keep in mind. It's one of the things, and that's part of what internal struggling is. And that's some also part of what understanding that the only way to get growth is through struggle. The only way to get progress is through struggle. And so people having different ideologies, naturally, when they come together, it will have some type of struggle that ensues. But when you can engage in that struggle respectfully and lovingly and non-violently, it leaves room to progress from it and to grow from it. So I think that's something that was very important that Dr. King said. It's not one way to, another saying, it's not one way to skin a cat. There's 100 ways to skin a cat. I don't know what the saying is. But that is very true about this struggle that we are engaging in. And so I think that we need multiple organizations in Winnebago County and in Rockford, Illinois that are dedicated to struggling against police terrorism and mass incarceration and racial injustice. And we need those organizations to do it in their own ways, with their own ideologies, with their own tactics, with their own beliefs, their own philosophies. And that will get us to a place where the people struggling for these things have more power and have more strength, because they have to deal with more, because these institutions will have to deal with more than just one or two or three or a handful of entities struggling against them. So that's something that I thought was important to point out. I think another one of the things that's important to point out is the emphasis, how Dr. King used the platform that he had as the pastor of the as the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, to try to educate the community of Montgomery on the political issues, on the social issues, on the economic issues that were going on. We need more people in Rockford 2021 and Winnebago County 2021 to be using their platform to educate people on these social issues, these economic issues, these financial issues, because of the implications that they have on all of us as members of this community. And so before this phone battery dies, I want to go ahead and wrap this live up. I want to try to get to another live today where we pick up in chapter 7 of the Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm going to end this live how we end the lives and say, rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Mark Barmore, rest in power to Jovan Fresco, rest in power to... Go fuck yourself, you racist piece of shit. Fuck you, you racist fuck. Racist fuck. Get a car, motherfucker. Okay, again, rest in power to Demetrius Bennett, rest in power to Jovan Fresco, rest in power to Geno Washington, rest in power to Logan Bell, rest in power to Kerry Blake, rest in power to Mark Barmore, rest in power to Philip Johnson, rest in power to Jasper Banks, rest in power to Suzette Babler, rest in power to Faustin Guaitigo, rest in power to Shannon Graves, rest in power to Eddie Patterson, rest in power to Joseph McCormick, rest in power to Lil Mike Sago, and rest in power to Mikey Guzman. We outside.